what would define the success of the upcoming COP? What must COP30 deliver? We are on the road to COP30 taking place in Belém, Brazil, and the excitement and tension is palpable. Everyone everywhere has something to say and wants to be heard. And if you followed the conversations on COP29 last year, then you probably heard it being called a finance COP. And as the dust settled in Baku, it left many feeling underwhelmed and disappointed by what they saw as half measures and unfinished business. For others, it marked a step forward. And of course, Gringo TV took you through it all, bringing the latest updates and conversations. Well, it's another COP season, and it's been a year of tense geopolitics and devastating climate change field events. So there is indeed a lot on the table. And COP30 is shaped up to be an implementation COP, and we can't but wait to see where that's headed. I have some amazing experts joining me on today's program to take us through the expectations for COP30. I have Jessica Bigley, Policy Lead, Global Climate and Health Alliance, and Axel Eriksson, a member of the United Nations Secretary General Youth Advisory on Climate Change and Training Manager at the Youth Negotiators Academy. It's a pleasure to have you both on the program. I'll start with you, Jessica. How are you doing today, and how are the preparations going for COP30?
I'm really well, thank you, Tony.
So, like I said, we did have you here during COP29 last year, and you spoke about your expectations, especially on the health aspect in terms of what the negotiations was expected to be and the outcomes. So before we look to Belém, I want you to take me back to COP29. What were you hoping would come out of the negotiations, and what imprints did it leave on you? I mean, the outcome of COP29, what imprints did it leave on you? Was it positive or negative? Just a bit on looking back on the last conference, where are you now?
So there were issues both with the quantity but also with the quality. Climate finance really needs to be based on public grant-based finance to avoid exacerbating cycles of debt and poverty and disease. And we didn't see a commitment in the new collective quantified goal that was adopted at COP29 for that target specifically for public grant-based finance. And we know that the poorest countries in the world are already spending more on debt service than they are on health and education and infrastructure combined.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. Let me also hear from Axel as well. Let me come to you, Axel. What are your thoughts on the outcomes of COP29 last year? Where did that leave you in terms of, being optimistic towards the next COP, and then, of course, the outcomes of the negotiations? Like I said, a lot of people felt there was unfinished business left at COP29. What imprints did COP29 leave on you, Axel?
For me, aside from what came out of it in terms of the decisions and outcomes, also the procedure was quite particular in the sense that towards the last few days, there were many consultations to try to get the different decisions across, and specific on the new collective quantified goal, it had quite intense consultations, which very regrettably excluded many of the most affected parties, like these developed countries and small island states. In many of those contexts, the procedure was not including all the actors that were needed. So that's one particular imprint that I have with me from then, that the procedure was unjust in that sense. Also, when the adoption of the new collective quantified goal happened, there were several objections from parties who had expressed before the decision that they wanted to take the floor before it was made, and then the consensus was declared before they had a chance to raise their voices, which procedurally is quite sensitive to do it in that manner, and it raised many objections from parties afterwards, including India and Nigeria, who took the floor and said that they do not accept the decision as it was not taken in a way which hurt them. So also the procedure was quite challenging for many parties.
All right, so hanging on to that, what lessons do you believe should be taken from COP29 into the COP30 approach? I mean, you're speaking a lot on procedures. So how do we approach that? How do we take from that into the upcoming COP conference?
Yeah, well, one crucial detail is that this COP conference, COP30, is happening in a context where the prices for accommodations have been rising. There have been many concerns expressed, including among parties, that basically the cost of accommodation are excluding many of the most affected countries' delegates, especially since it goes beyond the daily subsistence allowance that normally allocated for the region. So that's one key concern about the process, that due to the high cost, many parties have found it challenging to even be represented in person there. And in terms of how to, consult in an inclusive manner, the COP presidency has made quite a big effort on this, in terms of having 4 different circles where it consults in different ways actors that have a stake or rights related to the process. So it does show an intention to really consult widely and make sure that the COP becomes inclusive in the way that the outcomes represent diverse views. And we will see during the actual COP how that happens in practice. However, I'm very pleased to hear that there is a strong intention to do so. Another key aspect is that it's not only about parties. It is crucial that rights holders also present at the COP. This includes indigenous communities, women's organizations, young people's networks, and so on. And the costs are also quite challenging, and the difficulty of receiving accreditation and many other factors that reduced accessibility. So this is something that I would expect from this COP, to make sure, both in practice and in writing, that it's as inclusive as possible.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Axel. And let me come back to you, Jessica. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of discussions and opinions flying around, on the upcoming conference. And I came across an argument that claims that, for the past 30 years, COP conferences have been stuck in political gridlock, and that they have repeatedly failed to deliver climate ambition and the justice that we actually need. So I want to know, what are your thoughts on that assertion? I'm seeing that you have been a part of these negotiations. You're usually at these conferences. And, like I said, last year, a lot of people were very much disappointed. It just seems like it was just a lot of politics and diplomacy. So what are your thoughts on that particular assertion?
I think it's really clear that we're in a particularly challenging global landscape at the moment, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of the availability of finance, whether that's for climate or for health. Like, we're seeing similar patterns across both. And I think for this COP, what it really comes down to is governments need to decide whether their allegiance is to their people or to companies, because we've seen the fossil fuel industry and other health harming industries undermine the outcomes that come from COP. It took until COP28 to talk about the need to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable way. Fossil fuels are the leading driver of climate change. And we saw 500 fossil fuel representatives at COP26, 600 at COP27, and 2,400 at COP28. It's completely unacceptable for profit-making entities to have this level of influence over the decisions that get made that are going to affect the lives of people. And we know that hundreds and thousands of people are dying due to the impacts of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-driven climate change every year. We also know that we are effectively paying these industries and continuing to support their profit-making. So in 2022, no less than $7 trillion US dollars were used to finance fossil fuel subsidies, whether that was in terms of direct finance to the fossil fuel industry or in failing to charge the health and other costs of that fossil fuel use and absorbing that into the price. And of course, we can't end fossil fuel subsidies overnight, but we can think about how to justly redirect those and reorient them to make sure that people still have energy access, because we know that's a huge determinant of health, but that we shift those subsidies to health promoting alternatives like renewable energy, ensuring that people have access to public services, and make the transitions in a way that works for people and not just for profit.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. I'm staying with you to the nitty-gritty of COP30. Like we said, it's being billed as an implementation COP. So what does this mean, and what expectations does this lay down for us?
So the time for reiterating commitments is really long past. We've talked about the importance of climate finance. We've failed to even agree to quantities and quality of climate finance that would be necessary. So first of all, we need to scale up commitments and not reiterate old ones. We also need to think from moving from those commitments, like the COP28 decision for a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, how those are going to be implemented. And that applies to mitigation and also to adaptation. And on implementation, for adaptation, as one example, we need to think about means of implementation indicators and tracking that finance and technology transfer and capacity building, and not just the outcomes that we see for adaptation, because if the support for implementation isn't there, then we're not going to be able to show the progress that's needed.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. And let me also hear from you on that, Axel. You know, when we talk about implementation, beyond the politics and the diplomacy, it really boils down to translating the solutions to the people in the real world, you know, whose lives are shaped by the climate crisis. So how can we move towards this, you know, and how optimistic are you that this can be achieved, whereby we see that there is actually the solutions properly implemented in these vulnerable communities that are actually suffering? How do you think this can be achieved? And, you know, are you optimistic that we can have that?
Yes, I think it's a crucial question for this to be an implementation COP, and that actually the solutions that exist are translated into concrete action. So as Jessica said, the time for just restating commitments without further action is in the past. So the UN Climate Convention has 3 different pillars to deal with how to actually implement things, the means of implementation. Finance is one that received quite a bit of attention, and this is a very clear gap that the countries that need it the most don't have the finance to implement solutions. Although the solutions exist, the finance to support that does not exist, or it's not that it doesn't exist; it's not provided. So this is also why there was such a large contention about the new collective quantified goal at COP29 last, ambitious outcomes on the financing. The second thing is on the technology transfer development, and here it is very crucial that the technologies that are being developed, whether it's for renewables or for other climate purposes, are actually distributed fairly, so to the context that actually need it. And with technological investment in basically all regions, not only in the global north. The third component is on capacity building. So making sure that there is an access to capacity building for the parties that need to implement these solutions. So making sure that programs to both negotiate effectively, to make plans, so national adaptation plans, for example, or national determined contributions, or other ways of really translating commitments into concrete action plans. That type of capacity building is also needed, specifically in most vulnerable countries.
Thank you so much, Axel.
So those are the 3 pillars I would emphasize, that we need ambition across all fronts: the finance, the technology, I hear you, and the capacity building.
All right, thank you so much, Axel. I'm still staying with you, and since we're still talking about vulnerable communities, as you know, adaptation is seeming to be the front and center for BELEM. And of course, it's important to have this conversation on adaptation because the statistics actually show that it remains underfunded. I mean, only 5% of the global climate finance flows were allocated to it between 2021 and 22. So the question now is, let's talk about the UAE BELEM work program on adaptation. What is it expected to achieve, and is it ambitious enough to ensure that vulnerable communities actually survive the climate shocks? Let's educate us a bit on that.
So to begin with, I would stress that the need for indicators in adaptation is absolutely crucial. So basically, being able to measure the progress on adaptation is important. And we had at the subsidiary body sessions a very long list of indicators, which were hard for parties to actually condense into indicators that they can actually use in practice. So that's one concrete expectation, to really have a list of indicators that are being approved in Belém to make sure that parties can start measuring their adaptation progress against the global goal adaptation. And for adaptation to basically be translated on the ground, it is absolutely crucial that it considers all sectors. So, and nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation is absolutely crucial there to make sure that adaptation solutions don't happen at the expense of biodiversity. Similarly with health, that often one of the ways that we are impacted by climate change is through health. And making sure that health systems are resilient to climate change, whether it is through energy access and so on, is crucial. So really looking across different sectors in the adaptation actions and making sure that they don't reinforce existing vulnerabilities, rather multi-solve basically the joint issues that we're facing. So those would be my two main points: having a clear list of indicators that are adopted, and also ensuring that there's a clear emphasis on the systemic nature of it, so that adaptation actions contribute to synergies.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much. Let me also hear from you, Jessica, as well. Do you believe that the UAE Belém work program on adaptation is ambitious enough to ensure that vulnerable communities actually survive the climate shocks?
I think there's been an incredible amount of work done by 78 experts that were identified by parties to come up with this initially very long list of thousands of indicators, and to boil this down for 100 indicators that are going to be considered by parties for adoption at COP30. At the same time, we can have the best indicators in the world on food, on agriculture, on poverty, on cultural heritage, on ecosystems. But unless we also have those means of implementation indicators that we're tracking to see if there are resources to deliver progress on those, then we're not going to see the gains that we need, and it will remain a technical exercise.
Okay, and I also want to touch on something. You know, early this year, there were two major court-issued opinions that framed climate action as a legal duty and not just a political choice. How do you think that can change the bargaining power of vulnerable countries at COP30?
Thank you. So looking at the advisory opinion that was issued, and I'm sure Axel can expand on this a great deal too, just some elements to really pick out are the fact that if governments aren't submitting nationally determined contributions, so national climate plans that are in line with the Paris Agreement, then they're really falling short of their responsibilities. The ICJ also reiterates the responsibility of developed countries to provide climate finance. There's often back and forth in the UNFCCC negotiations about whose responsibility it is to provide that finance, and the ICJ advisory opinion makes that really clear. I think that countries and communities in the Global South should really be making the most of this advisory opinion and exercising litigation wherever this is possible. And this, I think, will really shift the conversation in terms of who holds the power and who's accountable. And the more litigation cases we see, the more that will set precedents for an increased number of those. And
all right, thank you so much. All right, thank you so much, Jessica. And let me also hear Axel's thoughts on that as well. How does this advisory opinion by the ICJ change the game in climate negotiations?
So previously there has been a narrative that the 1.5 degrees goal is aspirational or optional, or whatever word you choose to use for it. However, the advisory opinion reaffirms that it is the goal that parties subscribe towards, both based on the Paris Agreement and also the best available science, the principle that guides international law. That's a very crucial element of it, but 1.5 degrees Celsius is basically the goal to strive for. And then secondly, it goes beyond just that countries are obliged to submit naturally determined contributions to indices, to actually emphasizing a duty of performance. So basically, they need to not only submit them, they need to be ambitious enough, and also they need to implement these. So and if they don't implement their commitments with sufficient action, they need to be. There are some circumstances under which they might be required to make some kind of reparations or some kind of basically compensation for not meeting sufficient ambition. So it does change the game in that regard too, that it goes beyond just the obligation to submit indices, but actually submitting ambitious enough indices. And the third thing that's very crucial there is the reaffirming the importance of the best available science. So this advisory opinion is very clearly guided by scientific evidence, not least from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been stands in contrast to the way the UNFCCC negotiations have been progressing in recent years, where there has been increasing questioning of science as one way to see it. So fossil fuel phase out is very much in line with scientific evidence, and this is something that the advisory opinion reaffirms. So importantly, it does provide support for being guided by the best available science as well. Those are the three ways that I see at this point that will reshape. One is the 1.5 degrees is a goal. Number two, the obligations go beyond just submitting indices. And number three, following what science commands.
All right, thank you so much, Ericsson. So finally, as we wrap up the program, so I want to know, heading towards COP30, for you on a personal level and based on your expertise, what would define the success of the upcoming COP? What must COP30 deliver?
It must deliver climate justice in essence. And what this means is that both the process and the outcomes need to be just. In terms of the process, we need to make sure that all the people who are affected by climate change are being represented at the table. This includes the representation of least developed countries and small island developing states and many other groups that have traditionally been underrepresented and who are now facing large constraints due to the crisis associated with this COP. Also in the consultations during the actual COP, it is necessary to take into account the interests of all parties to make sure that the process itself is just. And then in terms of the outcomes, it needs to consider basically what would be needed to ensure that there's a basic standard of well-being met everywhere in the world, not only subject to the availability of political will, not subject to all the caveats, but actually it needs to deliver well-being for all in terms of its goals, in terms of its commitment and so on. We cannot accept an outcome which puts at danger the most vulnerable communities. Since the finance exists, the solutions exist, the science is there, it's a matter of implementing it in line with climate justice.
All right, thank you so much, Axel. Let me also hear from you on the final note, Jessica. What would define the success of the upcoming COP30 for you?
So for me, there are three really clear outcomes from the negotiations that are needed from COP30. And the first is a very clear plan for how we're going to scale up from 300 billion of climate finance to 1.3 trillion, with an emphasis on public grant-based finance. And the second is that we particularly need to focus on adaptation finance. And we know that climate finance is very often skewed towards mitigation finance, but we absolutely need to also look at adaptation and loss and damage. On adaptation, least developed countries are calling for a tripling of a previous commitment to double adaptation finance from 2019 to 2025. This now needs to be tripled by 2030. And finally, we need governments to put in place the right institutional architecture to support the implementation of just transitions at national level. So this means that there should be the right mechanisms within the UNFCCC to provide support for action, to provide coordination on how these just transitions are going to be rolled out, because they are a practical concept and not merely a theoretical one.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica, and also to Axel as well for bringing this very needed insights and expectations as we look towards COP30. And as the world gears up to Belém, Brazil, the clock is ticking faster than ever, and the urgency is evident as we see the climate chaos unleash even more with deadly floods and so much more. So the question is, will leaders actually rise above politics to deliver real people-centered climate action? Well, we'll be watching and questioning it all right here on Green Grid TV. Until next time, I'm Tonya Gubanjo, and this has been Policy on the Go. Road to COP30. It's bye for now.